It was the spring of 1943. The Atlantic wind carried the smell of diesel and salt as a gray transport ship cut through the waves toward the Virginia coast. On board, hundreds of German soldiers stood in silence. Their uniforms were worn, their eyes hollow, their pride fractured by defeat. Among them was Sergeant Karl-Heinz Richter, 26 years old, a tanker from Rommel's Afrika Korps. Weeks earlier, he'd been fighting in the desert heat of Tunisia. Now, his boots echoed on the steel deck of a ship bound for the enemy's homeland. He had no idea what waited on the other side. Richter expected vengeance. He'd heard the propaganda. Americans were chaotic, cruel, ruled by greed. Nazi officers had told them that capture meant humiliation, torture, maybe death. So, as the ship neared shore, he braced for hatred. But when the hatch opened, he saw something that made his mind freeze. No jeering crowds, no armed mobs. Instead, clean barracks, green fields, and American soldiers offering cigarettes and coffee. The enemy smiled. Richter whispered, "This can't be America." But it was. And what he was about to experience, what hundreds of thousands of captured Germans would soon live through, would shake their beliefs more deeply than any defeat in battle. Because in the strange calm behind barbed wire, America was about to win a war of the mind. Under the unforgiving African sun, the German Afrika Korps had fought like ghosts. Fast, precise, relentless. For nearly 2 years, their legend grew. They were Rommel's elite, the Desert Fox's chosen soldiers. But by May 1943, that legend had turned to dust. Outnumbered and outsupplied, the once proud divisions of the Wehrmacht faced a storm they couldn't outrun. Allied tanks rolled across the desert. Bombers blackened the horizon. Food ran low. Ammunition ran lower. In a barren stretch of Tunisian sand, entire German units laid down their arms. It was the largest mass surrender of Axis troops since the beginning of the war. More than 250,000 men captured in North Africa alone. Among them, Sergeant Richter sat in silence, clutching his field cap as Allied trucks rolled past. He wasn't thinking about ideology anymore. He was thinking about survival. When Allied officers told the prisoners they would be sent to a safe place across the ocean, most laughed bitterly. Safe? From what, starvation or the firing squad? The first days of captivity blurred together. Camps in Algeria, makeshift holding pens in Morocco. Then word spread, "We're going to America." First, no one believed it. America was the enemy's heart. To a German soldier raised on years of propaganda, the very name carried an image of chaos and barbarism. One prisoner scoffed, "They'll shoot us at the docks." Another whispered, "They'll make us slaves." But there was a quiet curiosity, too. What if the enemy wasn't what they'd been told? The voyage took nearly 2 weeks. The ships were crowded, hot, and restless. Guards stood on deck with rifles, but few spoke. Most Americans seemed more tired than angry. At night, the prisoners watched the vast black ocean stretch endlessly around them. Some prayed for storms to sink the convoy. Others just stared, wondering if they'd ever see Germany again. When land finally appeared, green hills rising beyond the horizon, an eerie silence fell. "So this is the United States?" someone murmured. The coastline looked almost peaceful. There were no ruins, no smoke, no bombed cities. To men who'd spent years in a war-torn world, it felt alien, a country untouched by destruction. Their train journey south began that same night. Through barred windows, the POWs saw small towns slide past. Church steeples, white fences, and children waving from porches. No one threw stones. No one shouted. Many of the guards, young men barely older than the prisoners themselves, treated them with curt professionalism, even courtesy. At one station, an American sergeant offered the Germans fresh bread and water. "You'll need this," he said. "It's a long ride." Richter hesitated before taking it. "Why?" he asked in broken English. The sergeant just shrugged. "Because it's the right thing to do." The simplicity of that answer lingered. Days later, they arrived in Georgia. The air was heavy with pine and humidity. Trucks carried the men through wide fields toward what looked like a small town built behind fences. Wooden barracks, mess halls, even a small chapel. The fences were tall, yes, but the place wasn't grim. No iron cells. No shouting guards. Instead, American officers in clean uniforms directed the arrivals calmly, even politely. Richter stepped off the truck and stared. "This is a prison?" he muttered. An older POW laughed bitterly. "Maybe for them." Inside, the men were issued uniforms marked PW. They were fed warm food, stew, bread, coffee, more than they'd eaten in weeks. That night, lying on a clean mattress, Richter couldn't sleep. He had expected chains. Instead, he got comfort. He had expected hatred. Instead, indifference or something close to respect. And in the quiet darkness, that was almost harder to understand. Because if America was this, what else had the Reich lied about? He wouldn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning, guards led the prisoners outside, not for punishment, but to work. They were given tools, wages, and, most shockingly, choice. That small word, choice, would begin to unravel everything they thought they knew about war. When Sergeant Richter woke to the sound of birds instead of gunfire, it felt wrong. For the first time in years, there was no engine noise, no desert wind, no bombs. Just the hum of cicadas in the Georgia heat. Outside his barracks, the air smelled of pine and fresh bread from the mess hall. Prison, he thought, wasn't supposed to smell like this. A sign at the camp gate read, U.S. Army Prisoner of War Camp, Camp Gordon Johnston. Barbed wire surrounded the compound, yes. Guard towers stood at every corner. But the guards didn't pace like hunters. They leaned casually, chatting, smoking, laughing. Inside, life looked unervingly normal. Prisoners lined up for breakfast. Eggs, potatoes, coffee. Served by cooks who smiled, or at least didn't sneer. They could read American newspapers, visit the camp library, even write letters home. One POW whispered, "They're tricking us. They want us to drop our guard." Another muttered, "Then why feed us better than the Reich ever did?" By mid-morning, groups of prisoners were assigned to labor details. But this wasn't punishment, it was employment. They worked in nearby farms, cutting timber, or repairing roads, often under light supervision. American farmers who'd lost their sons to war watched in disbelief as German soldiers harvested their crops. Richter and his group spent their first day unloading lumber. When one board slipped and pinned a man's hand, an American medic rushed over instantly. "Hold still," the medic said, carefully freeing him. The German, shocked, managed only a trembling Danke. Afterward, that medic offered him a cigarette, an enemy soldier offering comfort to a man who'd once vowed to kill him. Richter stared at the cigarette for a long moment before taking it. Small gestures, a smoke, a kind word, chipped away at years of propaganda faster than any lecture could. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, word spread fast. The Americans are treating us like people. POWs there had libraries, orchestras, even a small theater. They built furniture, painted murals, and earned pay for their work. 80 cents a day, credited to an account they could use at the camp canteen. They bought chocolate, postcards, pencils. Some even bought cameras, taking photos of life behind the wire, smiling faces, soccer matches, makeshift Christmas trees built from scrap wood. Es ist kein Gefängnis. One soldier wrote home, "It's not a prison." What the Germans didn't realize was that this strange kindness wasn't chaos, it was strategy. Behind the barbed wire, the United States had created something unique, a psychological weapon disguised as mercy. The Office of War Information and the War Department had decided that every POW camp was a stage, and every prisoner an audience. The show they wanted to project was simple. Democracy worked. No propaganda film could compete with lived experience. If these men, trained to worship authority, to obey without question, could see a nation that valued order without tyranny, it could unravel the very foundation of Nazi loyalty. This wasn't generosity. It was subversion. Still, the experiment was risky. Camp commanders had to balance security with humanity. Some guards balked at the idea of spoiling the enemy. Others feared fraternization. But the results were undeniable. When Red Cross inspectors visited, they found morale high, discipline strong, and violence rare. In a report dated 1944, one U.S. Army psychologist wrote, "Prisoners treated with dignity respond with self-discipline. Deprived of an enemy image, they lose the will to resist." For the first time, warfare wasn't being fought just with bullets, but with ethics. At night, Richter and his comrades would gather in their barracks, talking in low voices. One man, a schoolteacher from Hamburg, said softly, "I saw the guard help that American farmer load a wagon. They worked like equals." Richter frowned. "And," the man hesitated, "and it made me wonder, what if we've been wrong?" The room went quiet. No one dared agree aloud. But that question, what if we've been wrong, stayed with them, quietly echoing between bunks. The American guards noticed the shift too. In early reports, officers observed that German soldiers, known for arrogance and discipline, were relaxing, even smiling. Some helped fix the camp's electrical wiring without being asked. Others volunteered to teach German lessons to curious Americans. One guard later recalled, "They started looking at us like people, not propaganda monsters, and maybe we started looking back the same way." It was subtle, almost invisible, but the psychological lines between enemy and human were blurring. And yet, not everyone approved. In Washington, critics argued the U.S. was being too lenient. "Why pamper the men who bombed London and shot our boys?" they asked. But General George Marshall defended the policy. "How we treat prisoners will be remembered. We're not just winning a war. We're defining who we are." It was a dangerous gamble, fighting hate not with vengeance but with example. Still, in the small, contained world of the POW camps, it was working. Every fair meal, every honest paycheck, every small act of dignity planted a seed, one that would grow long after the war ended. Late one night, Richter sat by his barrack window. Fireflies blinked across the dark field. Somewhere, faint jazz drifted from the guard's radio. He thought of the propaganda posters back home, the ones showing America as a land of chaos, crime, and greed. And he whispered to himself, "They lied to us." For the first time, he wasn't thinking like a soldier. He was thinking like a man. But the quiet wouldn't last. Because even inside these peaceful camps, a darker war was brewing. One that would pit German against German, faith against fear. By midsummer 1944, Camp Ruston looked less like a prison and more like a small town behind wire. Gardens bloomed. Laundry lines fluttered. From a distance you'd think it was a college campus until you saw the towers. Every afternoon, the sound of a baseball cracking off would echo through the pines. German POWs in mismatched uniforms sprinted across the field, shouting in a mix of English and Swabian. On the mound, an American sergeant grinned. "Strike three." The crowd, half Germans, half guards, cheered. Richter sat on the bench, glove in hand, stunned. Baseball. A game he'd once seen in a propaganda film ridiculed as childish. Yet here, under the southern sun, it wasn't childish. It was freedom in motion. No ranks, no salutes, just play. He watched a captain slide into base and laugh as red dust streaked his uniform. In that moment, hierarchy dissolved. And with it, something deeper began to crack. After the game, prisoners crowded around a projector in the recreation hall. Tonight's film, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Richter expected another American boast piece, but what he saw unsettled him more. A senator fighting his own government? A hero collapsing in exhaustion for truth? That couldn't be propaganda, it was too honest. When the lights came up, no one spoke. One POW muttered, "They let people make films like that?" Another whispered, "Imagine showing that in Berlin." The silence that followed was heavier than any sermon. Soon classes began. American volunteers taught English, mathematics, and even philosophy. The Red Cross delivered textbooks. Richter, curious, joined an English course taught by a guard named Miller. Miller was a former teacher from Ohio, soft-spoken, patient, the kind of man who listened before correcting. On the blackboard, he wrote a single phrase, "All men are created equal." Richter frowned. "But you have ranks, orders, commanders," he said. Miller smiled. "Equality isn't sameness," he replied. "It's dignity." The words stuck like a splinter. Dignity. Not superiority. Not fear. Richter lay awake that night, thinking of it. Back home, he'd been taught that worth was earned through obedience. Here, dignity was given by default. The camp began to hum with small revolutions. Some POWs started a jazz band using instruments from the Salvation Army. Trumpets blared. Drums rattled. American soldiers gathered by the fence to listen, clapping along. Others painted murals, one showing a sunrise over broken chains. The commanders encouraged it, calling it morale development. But to the men, it was liberation disguised as hobby. They discovered a strange new intoxication, choice. Every day they chose whether to work, to study, to play. And in that choosing, they practiced democracy without realizing it. Of course, not everyone welcomed this awakening. Inside every barracks there were still the diehards, the true believers. They wore invisible uniforms, carried invisible flags. To them, baseball was weakness. Books were poison. At night, they whispered, "Remember who you are. The Führer still watches." When a young POW named Ernst spoke admiringly of America's organization, they beat him bloody. The message was clear: think freely, and you're the enemy. Richter helped carry Ernst to the infirmary. The guard on duty said nothing, just bandaged the boy's head and muttered, "Some wars never end." That sentence burned deeper than the sight of blood. Still, the cultural current couldn't be stopped. In the mess hall, debates flared about freedom, responsibility, guilt. One afternoon, an American chaplain asked if anyone wanted to attend a lecture on democracy. Half the camp showed up. He spoke simply, "Freedom isn't perfect. It argues with itself every day. But it lets you speak." For men raised under censorship, that idea felt like staring into sunlight. Later that week, prisoners requested newspapers, American ones. They devoured headlines about Roosevelt, labor strikes, even criticism of the war itself. Amazed, one POW said, "They can print that without being shot?" The answer was yes. And with every page turned, the wall inside their minds crumbled a little more. By autumn, the change was visible. Guards stopped carrying rifles inside the camp. Incidents of defiance dropped to nearly zero. When a hurricane struck the Gulf Coast, POW volunteers sandbagged nearby towns. Locals who'd once cursed Krauts brought them sandwiches. A Louisiana farmer told a reporter, "They work like our boys used to." The irony was hard to ignore. Men who'd once sworn to destroy democracy were now helping to save American homes. Richter watched it all quietly. Every friendly handshake felt like a confession he didn't know how to make. He began writing in a small notebook he'd traded for cigarettes. On the first page he wrote, "If they are human, then what are we?" But transformation is fragile. The hardliners saw it spreading and grew desperate. Whispers of traitor and sympathizer echoed through the barracks. Rumors reached the guards. A secret honor court forming inside the camp. Names were being written on a list. For the first time in months, fear returned. One evening, as the jazz band practiced, an explosion of shouts erupted from another block. A man lay beaten near the washroom. His only crime, singing "You Are My Sunshine." The next morning, guards increased patrols. Richter looked at the bruised soldier and felt the same rage he'd once reserved for the enemy. The battle lines had shifted. Now the war wasn't between nations, it was between conscience and control. And it was far from over. He folded his notebook shut and stared at the fence glittering in moonlight. Outside, an American searchlight swept lazily across the yard. Inside, a storm was brewing among his own people. The camp, once peaceful, was becoming a powder keg. The question now wasn't whether they would change. It was who would be allowed to. By winter 1944, the camp's fences no longer divided enemies from captors. They divided Germans from themselves. What had begun as quiet suspicion was now open warfare of ideology. Inside Barrack 7, men whispered late into the night. Not about escape, but about loyalty, about purity, about honor. They called themselves the true Germans, diehards who still saluted invisible flags and swore allegiance to a dead idea. And they had rules. Speak English too fluently? Traitor. Attend American classes? Collaborator. Show gratitude? You'd forgotten who you were. They enforced discipline through fear, not with rifles but with ropes and fists. One freezing night, Richter heard muffled screams outside. A group of men stood near the latrine, surrounding someone on the ground. He recognized the victim, Ernst, the same young prisoner who'd once been beaten for praising American democracy. This time he wasn't lucky. The next morning, guards found Ernst's body behind the laundry shed. His death report listed unknown causes. But everyone in the camp knew the truth. The Nazis had killed one of their own. The murder sent shockwaves through the barracks. For the first time, the Americans realized what had been brewing under their watch. A secret resistance, born not of defiance against the U.S., but against change itself. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, investigators uncovered coded messages, underground courts, even Nazi propaganda leaflets printed on stolen Red Cross paper. Some POWs carved swastikas into tables. Others painted them on walls. To the fanatics, surrender had not ended the war. It had simply moved the battlefield inside their minds. The U.S. Army launched investigations. Intelligence officers disguised as guards interviewed prisoners, recording confessions. Camp leaders were transferred. Extremists were quietly isolated in high-security compounds, segregation camps, built deep in the Midwest. But it wasn't just punishment. It was damage control. America had built its moral weapon on trust and fairness. But now that same freedom had given the fanatics room to breathe. One internal memo read, "Democracy is being tested within the walls meant to teach it." It was an uncomfortable irony. For the moderates, men like Richter, life became a tightrope. He avoided the radicals, but they watched him constantly. When he wrote a letter home describing how Americans treat us decently, it was confiscated by fellow POWs before it ever reached a censor. Every smile to a guard was recorded. Every word of English whispered. The camps became theaters of paranoia. To survive, Richter learned to wear two faces, the loyal soldier by day, the questioning man by night. He wasn't alone. Across America, hundreds of German prisoners quietly rebelled. Not with violence, but with doubt. They held secret study circles, trading books about democracy under blankets. They debated ethics, justice, even guilt. Each conversation was dangerous. Each new idea a spark in the dark. But change was contagious. At Camp McCain, Mississippi, POWs formed a small debate club. One night, a guard slipped them a copy of the U.S. Constitution. It circulated like contraband. One officer wrote in his journal, "For the first time, I understand why they fight. They have laws that bind even their leaders." To men raised under absolute obedience, that realization was revolutionary. And revolutions, even quiet ones, always provoke a reaction. By late 1944, the Nazi cliques were losing control. Their symbols began to vanish from walls. Their threats carried less weight. The moderates had found something stronger than fear: solidarity. When a radical tried to rally them, someone shouted, "The Reich is gone. Get over it." Laughter followed. It was the sound of liberation disguised as mockery. In those moments, democracy didn't arrive through lectures or pamphlets. It arrived through courage, through the simple act of saying no. But the violence wasn't done. One night in December, at a camp in Arizona, radicals set fire to a workshop after hearing it played American jazz. The flames spread fast, lighting up the desert sky. Guards rushed in, rifles ready, but most prisoners were already forming a bucket line, saving the very camp built to contain them. When it was over, the commanding officer stood silent, watching German POWs douse embers alongside American soldiers. He turned to his aide and whispered, "We're not re-educating them. They're re-educating themselves." That winter, the camps began to change officially. Segregation zones were created for diehards. Moderates gained more trust and privileges. And for men like Richter, the fear finally began to lift. He joined a small discussion group run by an American chaplain who asked one question: "What will you do when you go home?" Richter hesitated. "Build something that doesn't fall apart," he said softly. The chaplain nodded. "Then maybe you've already won." By early 1945, the transformation was nearly complete. Many POWs now spoke fluent English, read American newspapers, and even volunteered to help harvest crops in nearby towns. For them, the war was no longer between nations, it was between who they had been and who they were becoming. Still, guilt lingered. Some wrote letters home apologizing for blind faith. Others dreamed of rebuilding Germany into something that could never produce another Führer. And though they didn't know it yet, that dream, born behind barbed wire, would become the foundation of post-war democracy in West Germany. But before that future could begin, the war itself had to end. And when it did, America faced one final decision: what to do with the prisoners who no longer thought like enemies. Spring 1945. Germany lay in ruins. Cities reduced to ash, rail lines twisted like melted wire. The once mighty Reich nothing more than smoke drifting over silence. In America, the camps waited for orders. The war was ending, and with it came a new uncertainty: what happens to the enemy when the fighting stops? For men like Karl-Heinz Richter, it meant going home to a place that no longer existed. The first rumors came by radio. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The empire gone. Inside Camp Rustin, the prisoners listened in stunned quiet. Some cried. Others stared at the ground, faces blank. Richter felt nothing at first, just a hollow ache. For years, his loyalty had been armor. Now it dissolved in seconds. Everything he'd believed in had vanished. That night, he walked to the edge of the fence and looked out at the pine trees swaying in the warm wind. For months, those wires had meant captivity. Now they felt like protection from the chaos waiting across the ocean. The U.S. Army began processing releases. Over 400,000 German POWs were to be sent home. Trains rolled north, carrying men through small towns that had once feared them. In Georgia, children waved flags as the convoys passed. At each stop, American guards shook hands with departing prisoners, sometimes even trading addresses. "Write to me," one sergeant told Richter. Richter smiled, pocketing the note. "You're sure?" The sergeant laughed. "Why not? You're the best lumberman I ever had." It wasn't friendship. It was something deeper: recognition. Two men, once enemies, now just human. The ships crossing the Atlantic were quieter this time. No guards shouting. No fear. On deck, POWs stood together, watching the coastline shrink. They carried duffel bags filled with letters, small gifts, notebooks, and something intangible: perspective. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "We came to America as soldiers of the Reich. We leave as witnesses of another way to live." For many, that other way became a compass. When Richter finally reached Germany, he barely recognized it. The cities were skeletons. Streets lined with rubble and hungry children. His mother's house in Hanover was gone. Only the foundation remained. She had survived, but barely. And when she saw him, she wept not from joy, but from confusion. "You're alive?" she whispered. "They said prisoners starved in America." Richter shook his head. "No, mother," he said softly. "We ate well. We learned more than we deserved." That night, he opened his old notebook, the one from Camp Rustin, and read his first entry. "If they are human, then what are we?" He smiled sadly and wrote beneath it, "Now I know." Over the next few years, stories like Richter's spread quietly across post-war Germany. Former POWs became teachers, farmers, mayors. They rebuilt towns, reopened schools, and raised children who believed democracy was worth protecting. The U.S. Army called it re-education. Historians later called it soft power. But the truth was simpler. The war behind the wire had planted seeds. Seeds that would grow into the democratic heart of West Germany. In 1953, Richter received a letter from America. It was from Miller, the guard who'd taught him English. Inside was a faded photograph. The baseball field at Camp Rustin, now overgrown but still standing. On the back, Miller had written, "Freedom isn't what you're given, it's what you pass on." Richter kept the photo until he died. Not all stories ended so cleanly. Some former POWs returned bitter, unable to reconcile kindness from an enemy. Others struggled with guilt, haunted by what they'd believed or ignored or done. But for many, the experience had broken a spell. They had seen a world where authority served the people, not the other way around. And that vision, born in captivity, outlived the Reich itself. By the 1970s, historians interviewing ex-POWs found a pattern. Men who'd spent time in American camps were more likely to support democracy, education, and international cooperation. One researcher summarized it bluntly. The U.S. didn't just win the war with weapons. It won with decency. And perhaps that was the quietest, most dangerous victory of all, because it couldn't be bombed, erased, or undone. Years later, divers found the ruins of German U-boats on the Atlantic floor, relics of a war built on obedience. Above them, somewhere in the calm of history, floated the invisible victory America had forged through restraint. A victory that proved an old truth. You can break a man's weapon. You can't break the part of him that learns mercy. When Karl-Heinz Richter's grandson visited the United States decades later, he stood on the same soil where his grandfather had once been a prisoner. He looked around and said quietly, "He told me America saved his life. Not from war, but from hate. That is the quiet victory. The one fought not with tanks or bombs, but with coffee, fairness, and respect. The one that turned enemies into students and prisoners into teachers. A war America won by refusing to act like the enemy. The guns fell silent long ago, but sometimes victory doesn't echo in explosions. It whispers in choices. For America, the story of the German POWs wasn't about power. It was about proof that humanity, even in war, could be a weapon stronger than fear. Behind the fences of places like Ruston and Tonkawa, the U.S. built something history almost forgot. A victory that left no ruins, no graves, only changed minds. Because the real triumph of World War II wasn't just the end of tyranny. It was the moment when enemies looked at their captors and saw people. If you want more untold stories where compassion turned the tide, where hearts, not guns, decided history, subscribe and join us on the next forgotten front of World War II. Because the past isn't over. It's waiting to be understood.